Serena from Vela.
All right, hi everybody. My name's Serena Deutsch. I'm the manager of strategic initiatives for Vela. We're so glad you're all here today. I want to thank all of you for staying till the last session. I'll be brief. I know we've got a last great session in store. I want to thank Eric and the Kennesaw State team. This is a really amazing event. This was my first time here. I've been hearing about it for years, so I'm glad to be in on the hype finally. And just to share a little bit about Vela, and you can see info on your tables as well, but we support education founders building sustainable businesses and in education. We provide early capital, access to a thriving community of entrepreneurs, and connections to resources and support. I'd love if Vela founders or grantees could raise their hands, see who's in the room. All right, okay, great, amazing. We've had so much fun getting to see many of you, new faces, old faces, and would love to keep in touch. And so we'll end with a little bit of a call to the next time we can gather. Vela is hosting its first ever VelaCon this summer, June 13th to 15th in Washington, D.C. Our public registration will go live very soon. So if you're not already, our website is on the flyers, vela.org. We'll be announcing it via our website and social media. So if you want to build on the energy of this and gather again, we'd love to see many of you in DC this summer. Yeah, we look forward to keeping the conversation going.
So for our closing session this year, our theme has been on institution building and sustainability among these schools. Next year, we're going to talk more about increasing access. So how do we get more kids into these schools? So I kind of wanted to bridge those two. And I titled this session, Eccentricity, Authenticity, and Access, Sustaining Innovation and Expanding Reach by Hybrid Schools. So that's a little bit of a clickbait kind of headline, right? A little bit of an exaggeration again. Obviously adding that word eccentricity is a little bit much. But the point I'm getting at is, how might we think about hybrid schools and micro schools maintaining their identities and their creativity while also coming under lots more regulatory scrutiny and just public awareness, while also trying to expand access. So they're trying to do all these things at the same time. How can we keep this kind of organic, small scale, hyper-local innovation going? So on this panel we have voices from sort of the national level, the state level, and the local level. So we have Robert Enlow from EdChoice. That's right. We have Kyle Wingfield, who's the president of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, right? At the state level. And then for our local voice, we have Dalena Wallace from AIM Educational Collaborative in Kansas. So this will be another panel that's conversational, but I'll start it off with a couple of questions myself, and then we'll go to you all. So first, how have you, maybe from your perspective, either the national level, the state level, or the local level, how have you seen the landscape for these schools kind of evolve? How's it changing over the last few years?
The landscape for the schools changing. First of all, you guys have been doing this for a long time in many ways, in many instances, right? So I think the landscape, one of the things I'd say about the landscape is the national policy advocates are trying to catch up with you all. And so this is why ESAs are coming on board in many ways, because we see the opportunity that's coming about. So this interesting bridge between sort of what you're doing already and this growth in sort of mixed model delivery, right, of education. So it used to be that school choice was about, oh, let's give a private school parent a voucher or a tax credit or something. Now it's about giving them the opportunity to customize and use different types of learning environments. So on one hand, the policy environment across the country is catching up with you. Which means, in some ways, because of COVID and your incredible work, you guys are growing, right? There's lots of dynamism going on. There's lots of, you're moving from the sort of underneath the landscape to above the landscape. And that brings challenges. And that brings lots and lots of challenges, because when you're the bright, shiny object, everyone wants a piece. And so there's a conversation that to be had as we look at the national landscape and how it's evolving. How will accountability policy come out, right? So traditional school choice has always been about like this idea of, look, hey, we're going to have a voucher and it's going to go to a private school, right? And they're going to be regulated this way. And what's happening because of the dynamism of you guys is it's changing the nature of what accountability might look like. And what do we mean by accountability, right? Is it a test? Is it not a test? Is it parent-driven? Is it not parent-driven? Is it bottom-up or is it top-down? What does it mean by allowing a regulatory environment? You know, you guys face a ton of different regulations that private schools do. So the conversation that you guys are bringing to the table in the evolving landscape is one where I don't know if you know this, but you're changing the nature of how policy is being developed. Moving from seat time to competency, moving from completion to mastery. And this is both an amazing thing, but it's also a very challenging thing, as those of us who've been working in ESAs the last few years to implement them well have found. So that's, I think, part of the changing landscape on the national level.
Thanks. Yeah, talking about what we see here at the state level, specifically in Georgia, echoing some of what Robert was saying, but we've put in place or are putting in place some policies that we hope will be helpful to the people doing your work in our state. So we just passed an ESA. It'll be signed by the governor on Tuesday. Not everything, certainly, we as advocates wanted it to be. There's some limitations there that we're going to be working on in the future to try to expand and make better. That comes on the heels of a few years ago, we passed a Learning Pod Protection Act that I think was COVID inspired, but has shown some real world applicability here for hybrid homeschools. Eric and I were involved in trying to work with some hybrid homeschools right here in Cobb County who were being told by the fire marshal that they didn't have the proper building permit or certificate of occupancy, rather, for school. And we had passed that law a year earlier. We were able to go to the county and say, along with our friends at the Institute for Justice, always helps when you have a lawyer working with you on these things, but we were able to go to them and say, no, look, this law passed last year applies to these students and this school, and you need to let them keep operating the way they are. And for a couple of schools we didn't get to in time, but a couple of them we did, and they're still operating. In fact, I think I saw one of them was represented on the program today. So that's great to see that a couple years later that's worked. So I think the next iteration of that change is kind of the back and forth between those of us who work in policy, try to get something put on the books, see how it works, and then we need those of you who are on the ground doing these things to come to us and say, hey, the way this is getting done is not going to work for us. We've got to change this. Whether it's in either of those pieces of legislation, the other school choice programs we have here in Georgia. So I think that's what we're going to be looking for next in terms of a change is how do we make the things that we've put in place work better for the practitioners?
And I guess that's where I come in. I am on the ground and I am the practitioner as a homeschool mom. So I don't know if anyone's ever suffered from like imposter syndrome or anything, but I'm up here with these guys and I'm like, what? I don't know what has happened over the past couple of years, except that homeschooling is exploding. Hybrid schooling is exploding, and it's very exciting. Eric mentioned, this has been happening, or maybe it was Robert, this has been happening for years and years and years, and now policy is just trying to catch up to it, and that's definitely what I'm seeing. So I've been homeschooling for over 10 years. I've been hybrid homeschooling for the past 5, ever since my kids got so old that I could not figure out how to teach all of their lessons. And I'm like, okay, I got to find this teacher, I got to send them to that class, or create the program. I'm the director of a homeschool co-op and a micro school that started in my home, that's now in my friend's home. But I believe so much in the movement, and I'm seeing a lot of new families come on the scene to homeschooling. And I kind of have a foot in both worlds as far as the traditional homeschool mom who's like, guard my freedom and don't infringe on any of that. But I also very much value the movement of these hybrid school models and things like that, and can see the value in school choice policies for their benefit. So that's kind of the landscape I've seen
Great, thank you. So that's perfect, yeah. And you're not an imposter, you're fine, right? Not at all. Yeah, so I went to high school and college in the 90s. And if you were around then in high school or college, it was like a huge insult to call somebody a sellout, right? So it was more, you wanted to be authentic, right? Today, everybody wants to be an influencer or something, right? But back then, you wanted to avoid being a sellout. So right now, we have all these really unique, dare I say, eccentric hybrid and micro schools floating around. Lots of them have been doing their thing for a long time, just in whatever space, whatever shabby basement space they can find to operate, right? But as things become more popular, as they scale up, right? Maybe as money starts to show up, as regulations start to show up, there's kind of a pull towards selling out or homogenizing or copying other people, maybe that you don't want to copy, but you feel like you have to. So my question to you all is, to what extent is that a concern of yours, right? Maybe if we look up in 10 years, will we have a much more homogenized landscape in this room, or will the field be able to stay sort of authentic and creative and eccentric? Yeah.
As diverse as homeschoolers are, I think that same diversity is going to carry over into this movement of hybrid schools. The school founders who are starting these creative learning environments, all of them are unique, and they are serving unique needs in their community. And I think it's wonderful. So I've helped to found a network in Wichita. It's called WISE, and it stands for Wichita Innovative Schools and Educators. And the diversity in that group alone of 25 to 30 educators is so vast and so beautiful, because they're meeting needs that are unique, and they just don't look the same. So that homogenized thing is not really happening at this point. And I can see, like, to your point, like, is that something that we might be drifting toward? And I don't know. I don't know if that will happen. I think there's enough unique needs out there and people who are willing to meet them in creative ways.
I sure hope not, and this is the kind of thing that we try to keep in mind as we're working on policy design, is that we're not unwittingly pushing folks into that kind of direction. I mean, how many times have you heard in the education policy debate space, one size does not fit all, right? Well, we're not just trying to make one size fit all apply to more different brands of clothing, I guess, to really torture the analogy. You know, we want to, from a policy design standpoint, and in our state, and I'm confident in each of your states, we want to design it with the flexibility so that if your vision is to grow your school into a network, that you'll be able to do that. If it's to remain teaching, 12 or 15 kids in a particular neighborhood, and that's the heart that you have, we want you to be able to do that too. We don't want policy designed to push you in one direction or the other. So I hope we're not doing that. I hope we're going to be allowing everybody to pursue their vision the way that they see fit.
So for you 90s babies out there, I'm going to give you the 80s version of this, right? So, raise my speaker up above my head and get that. So, look, the biggest fear that Dr. Friedman had about private school choice was the regulatory capture of educators and of any market system, right? This is the number one issue that we face, and it is the number one issue we will face going forward on choice. This is exemplified by our charter school movement. My dear friends in the charter school movement have been caught in many ways through regulatory capture. Love many of them, but the reality is we've accepted too many regulations in education provision of choice schools. So this is the biggest fear we have to face, and I am definitely worried about this issue, that we will lose this incredible ragtag army that is fighting against the Cylon Empire, to date me yet even further back in the 70s, right? And there's a couple things I think we need to think about here, right? So first of all, resist definition. To define is to regulate. And so when you think about how policies are trying to come out and say, well, we should define, I appreciate the learning pod thing, but to define it means you can regulate it, right? And what makes you guys unique right now is it's hard to define you. Are you in a private school or a public school or a charter school or at home or half home and hybrid, or what are you? And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's the dynamism of a market. So be careful of definitions, right? Because that can lead to government strings. That is the biggest worry of regulatory capture, right? The second thing is the choice movement, the private school choice movement that I've been involved with for a long time, talked a lot about demand. It really didn't know anything about supply. The charter school movement knew a ton about supply, and they focused on certain types of schools that they liked. Which leads me to my next question that you guys are going to be thoughtful about that in order to avoid homogeneity, and that is beware of philanthropy. Right? Philanthropy is important, but you have to maintain your ability to say no. In our business and coalition work, the only way they work is when a local coalition has, every one member has the ability to say no. If you change the dynamic of power, you change the dynamic of ownership. And so as you think about philanthropy and what it does, you've got to be very thoughtful about that. Because in the charter sector, it had a massive impact on what kind of schools started, right? Because if you hear the word scale, right, you hear the words of certain charter management organizations, right? And the other thing is, I would say, is we got to be careful when we regulate to not be afraid of for-profits, right? The most amount of money in K-12 education in America is in for-profits, right? So if you look at our traditional public schools, the only thing nonprofit about it or government run about it is the actual teaching and staffing. That's all rest of it's for-profits. Buses, textbooks, all that's for-profit company. We cannot be afraid of that, right? So I would say the key things to remember for my biggest worry, this ability to not be homogenous, is one, to celebrate the diversity, because that's super important. It's, ragtag army, or to quote Ferris, quote Breakfast Club, every one of us is a dweeb, is a nerd, is a princess, is whatever, right? And to avoid be careful of definitions, be careful of philanthropy, keep the autonomy and power that you have, and then join the movement for ESAs saying that, so the legislators can hear it on every level. So sorry for being too long, but that's something.
No, that was great. That was great. So here's my last question before we go to you all. So I've been looking at researching these for almost 10 years. I've been working with these schools for more than 10. Certainly before COVID, they were definitely mostly a phenomenon of sort of the middle to upper middle class, right? And I still think that these schools present an opportunity to really expand school choice to the broad middle class, especially with so many more people working from home more. Since COVID, though, it seems like these schools have pulled in new families from both sides of the income distribution, right? The upper end of the distribution will be okay no matter what we do or talk about, right? But to sort of bridge to this question of access, how do we expand access to these schools? Where if you're a micro school, you might not necessarily be cheaper than a nearby private school. If you're a hybrid school, you need someone at home some of the time to help with the kids. How do we expand access to these schools to sort of the lower end of the income distribution? You have ideas about that?
Yeah, a couple of ideas. Hold on. A couple of ideas. One, again, the charter school sector is instructive here. Charter schools were universal choice programs, right, open to all, but the supply focused almost exclusively in urban areas, right? So that was one thing they actually got right? When they thought about fixing the problem, they actually started building supply in urban areas, trying to help those the least among us. So that was interesting. At the same time, the private school choice movement, well, we can't be open to all, so we'll have to have low-income choice programs, but we really didn't actually increase the supply in low-income communities, right? So I think that's an important instructive thing to remember. Number two, I think we have to be thoughtful about the communities that we want to help in or we want to be part of. Don't go, the philanthropists and the policy folks like myself can't go and do anything to a community. It has to be done with the community, and it has to be done all with the community. It can't be done just part of it, right? And you have to be really willing to embed yourself over time and build relationships. I think the way to solve this problem is A, to focus on the communities that need it most, and B, build authentic, meaningful partnerships and relationships over time, and be willing to do the long-term work rather than just jump out and get a win. And I think that's something we've got to be very careful about in the efforts going forward, that we pick the bright, shiny object, we like the new cool thing, and we don't really focus on some of the communities that need it most.
I think this works. Okay. Robert mentioned relationship and partnership, and that's one of the things in these smaller school models, these really creative, community-based schools, a lot of times you'll have to allow access for students that otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. You have like a bartering system that happens, and volunteering, and a trade between the parent and the teacher. That's very personalized, and I think, again, that just goes back to this is a whole individualized learning environment, and they work with the needs of each family to make it accessible. The micro school that my kids get to go to one day a week, she actually barters, so I live in a small rural town in Kansas, and so she barters with eggs, and she has another family who brings beef. And there's just certain ways that like we can do things like that. We can be creative because we're small, because we are autonomous, we are able to pivot, we're able to really meet the needs of our community in that way. And then as far as partnerships go, another sector that I think that needs to be more engaged in this whole movement is the church. I feel like right now the church has kind of taken a step back and allowed the government to kind of, you educate our kids for us. And I just don't think that should be. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for churches to be more engaged in this movement and to help provide services for families. Either they open their doors and they allow one of these hybrid models or these homeschool co-ops to meet within their facilities, or they sponsor one of the existing faith-based schools that are out there. And then another option is to provide scholarships for students that want to attend. So I don't think it needs to be like we're waiting around for ESAs to happen. So in the state of Kansas, we don't have school choice policy there. There's no ESAs. So what other things can we do? We can be creative. We're really good at that. And I also think that churches could help solve that problem and help provide some supplemental support.
Yeah, I think something that cuts through both of what both of them were talking about and even into the previous question is just how do we get the people who make the policies to reimagine how they think about education. When we go and we talk to a state legislator who doesn't really spend a lot of time on education, and frankly, even many of those who do, the model they have in mind is pretty much the traditional public school model. And it's like, okay, so you want to kind of do that, but also over there, or with fewer people, or focused on this different aspect. And I think a challenge that will speak to access, it will speak to keeping eccentricity, or whatever word Eric used, will be imagining a world where you can barter eggs for your child's education, right? Like getting people who make policy to think in those terms. And that's a challenge for those of us who work with them, right? So it's, I'm really, I guess, speaking to myself as much as anything, but I think we've got to change the mindset of just what education looks like if we're going to have success on these things.
So let me add to that real quick before we get to take questions. This is why you guys are so important as actually business owners, right? And business and school leaders. Look, legislators hear stories all the time from parents. That's the sort of thing. Let's go give. But what I'm experiencing with legislators, and I know what they really like. They like business leaders, or they like school leaders coming in saying, I've started a school and I'm going to start 2 more. I've started an environment, I'm going to start 2 more in your community. And that creates real economic power that they can see on a regular basis and has them reimagining it. My biggest fear for this entire effort that we're all engaged in right here to make sure kids get educated is that in 20 years or maybe 25 years, schooling will look roughly the same as it does today. And if we've done that, if it's not changed dramatically to look much more like you guys, then it's a real problem. And so I think the way you solve that is by helping your policymakers understand that you're bringing economic power to their districts by creating businesses and learning opportunities, not just for one family, but for many families.
That's great. Okay. What questions do you all have for the panelists?
Should I go first? Hi. I'm Jack Pinnell with Trinity Arch Prep in Phoenix, Arizona, the greatest state in the country for ESAs, in North America for ESAs. I have two comments and one question first. Thank you for this conference. It's my second time here, and it's been a very important conference. But I also feel that we are very much on the edge of a revolution, I would say. But I appreciate your cautionary words too. For instance, not falling in love with philanthropy because it could ruin all this in many ways. But I'm concerned when I come to conferences, I don't see enough diversity and diversity by race, by class, in other ways. And I'm afraid that the movement could become just a suburban white movement for wealthy Christian schools to continue to build wealthy Christian schools for all white children. And I worry about that. In Arizona, I think we have with ESAs an opportunity to intentionally create economically diverse schools by having sliding scale for tuition and really using that sliding scale to tell parents that we won't turn anyone away who deserves a right to be here. That seems to me to be a philosophical piece of the micro school, of the movement we're part of. And we're going to find a way, either the wealthy parents will pay more so that low-income families can come here, or that we will raise our tuition so out of the pocket everyone will pay more. And that's exactly what we're doing. So I wonder if you could, and there's schools around the country that are intentionally diverse socially, economically. I can't think of a school in Indianapolis. It's one of the most diverse private schools I know of in the world. And it's a church-based Christian school located in the black side of town. And was started by white families who came to the black side of the family. We want a school for your children and our children. And that school has grown tremendously. It's the Oaks, right? It's the Oaks School. Yeah. And so I think that we have an opportunity in this movement to flip the script for American schools when it comes to children of all races and all socioeconomic classes coming to schools. Would you like to comment on that, or there's a question in there somehow?
I appreciate you saying that. I think we've had this conversation at Harvard, as I recall, and the answer to this is the only way we get to diversity by design is through this kind of movement. You cannot get there through a government-mandated school system because we've seen what happens that way, right? So we have to be, the Oaks Academy is amazing. So the Oaks Academy was started by Governor Mitch Daniels, long before he was governor, right? It was a citizen Daniels, right, at that point. And he has now that school has become the most diverse private school in our state. And what we do with that, by the way, we've been part of an effort with the leader there to build new leaders using his program. So we've gotten 63 leaders to go through a program that he has been running to help make sure that we can pass on that diversity by design conversation.
I guess a question is for the two gentlemen in the middle. Between the two of you, I feel like I heard something that doesn't quite contradict each other, but could, which is the idea of getting involved and trying to get legislators involved and change policy. And then you, in the middle there, you were talking about, well, but we need to make sure that we make rules so that the person that's got just 17 kids versus the one who's got a multi whatever. So me, as somebody who runs something, I don't want to be involved with legislators. I want to keep my head so low that no legislator knows who I am or what I'm doing, because that way they can't make a rule about me. And yet, if I could know for sure that in all 50 states of the United States and Puerto Rico and Guam and all of those lovely places, that for sure we would do what the gentleman from Georgia says, which is we're going to ensure that we don't overregulate. Like, any suggestions for how to make sure we do the right thing and not the wrong thing when we get legislators and rule makers involved?
So I think anytime you're working with policymakers, you have to know what you're really trying to accomplish and what you won't allow to happen, right? So your North Star, where you're trying to go, and your red lines you won't cross. And I just think, this is easier said than done, of course, but I just think that kind of principle, that we're going to make it as widely applicable as we can, we're not going to force anyone to participate, has to be one of the red lines that we include. And that has to be, like, I was more concerned, and for those of you who don't live in Georgia, our ESA is only going to apply to students who are zoned for one of the bottom 25% schools by academics. That's not a policy design that we, the advocates, chose. It's one that we ultimately chose to live with. But if there had been provisions that didn't allow for the kind of experimentation and creativity and entrepreneurship, I would have been much more likely to stop and die on that hill rather than the eligibility. The eligibility we can go expand later on, and we're already working on how do we go about that, right? But if you get the regulatory part wrong from the beginning, you're probably going to kill any reason for them to expand it later right from the get-go. So, like I said, it's easier said than done. I just think that has to be one of those non-negotiables. And by the way, I know that homeschoolers get very nervous about these sorts of laws sometimes, and I completely understand why. We added a provision in our bill, totally unnecessary, because you had to apply to the program to be considered by it in any way. But we added a line saying that no, this won't apply to anyone homeschooling unless they apply for the program, just to belt and suspenders the thing, to make sure that we weren't encroaching anywhere that we didn't intend to encroach, and there was no way for anyone to interpret that we had. So I just add that as well.
I would agree with everything he said, and only add the question. So I appreciate keeping your head down. I think that's amazing because you're doing a job. My friends in the private school sector in Indiana, we would argue all the time about some schools want to keep their head down and some don't. The reality is legislators will do it to you, right? That's what they do, right? And if they find bad stories, they're going to come after it, right? And so the part of the conversation here is, how do you as leaders get your voice heard so that we can support the lack of regulation? Because policymakers like to have guardrails. They like to have things they know, right? And so there's two ways to do it. Don't engage with them, right? And don't engage with the policy. Don't take the ESA and be totally separate, which I'm fine with, right? I mean, I get that. Or if you're going to be involved with it, they've got to know that there's a consequence to not having policies that are favorable to you, which is why you need to be involved, in my opinion. Not everyone, but why you need to be involved, because if you don't have your voice heard, we've seen what happens when a bunch of policy advocates and wonks and people like me get out there and don't know what we're talking about, right? You got to get your voice heard, and you got to go from the bottom to the top rather than the top to the bottom, right? And that's true of advocacy and of support. So, well, I appreciate your point, and I totally agree with him. We need to be regular. We need more voices in order to defend this regulatory impulse that the state has.
Otherwise, we're the ones with imposter syndrome.
Yes, 100%, 100%.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conference. I was actually at the first and now here at the third, so even just to see numerically the number of people grow has been fantastic. And just following the research, obviously we're in an upswing. We're in a moment of growth in this sector, which is fantastic. But we're also, of course, talking about sustainability. And I'm just curious, for those of us that kind of watch the space, I think what transpired in Illinois regarding their legislation with the governor, et cetera, was, I don't know if it was shocking, but it was certainly a bit of a wake-up call that even as gains are made, that those can be retracted or rolled back at some point in the future. So I'm just wondering, again, we're in a very exciting moment, upswing, a lot of perseverance and creativity in this room, on the panel, but as we look towards long-term sustainability, thoughts on how to protect those gains and preserve them as we go forward.
I'll let you answer for your state, but I will tell you that the number one reason why universality is the big cause of the day right now is this issue. So don't let everyone say that oh gosh, all of a sudden we're all universal. We've been fighting for universal in places like West Virginia since 2016, right, with what Jamie's been doing and others. And the reason for that is because when you're universal, let me just give you an example of the voucher program in Indiana. There is a private school receiving scholarships in every single legislator's district that has been organized and communicated with, right? There are charter schools in our state that are only in 30 districts, right? So the reality of the conversation is you have universality and you have to fight for that in order to be broad and widespread, because the benefit that is delivered to all is the hardest one to take away.
Yeah, this was one thing that definitely kept us up as we were working on our ESA, and knowing that one of the important aspects about being limited in eligibility is the limit of the constituency, right? And I think you have to find the way to make the cost too high for someone to do what they did in Illinois. That may look different in every state. Ultimately, it's political. You don't do it by keeping your head down. I can tell you that. It is. There will be a backlash, a backswing against this upward trajectory you were talking about. We absolutely have to know that it's coming, be ready for it, and be prepared to make the cost too high for them to pay if they want to think about doing it. And again, that's probably going to look different everywhere, but I think that's got to be the mentality.
I primarily want to say thank you. I always say I'm a homeschool dinosaur because we homeschooled our children in the 80s in Washington State.
Is that illegal? That was illegal, right?
So I've seen a few years. And at that time, in the mid-'80s, when there were some people working very hard in our Olympia to create laws that had this built-in generous freedom. And so one thing about living in a state that goes for different things, we were different. So we were able to get a root system in that state that we weren't widely a wide practice until recent years, but we go deep, and the people in the legislature know that group of people. So we have felt pretty good about that. What I want to say, I want to thank you for what you're doing and the spirit in which you're doing it. Because this whole subject of whether to keep your head down, who's going to benefit from regulations, who will regulations end up ultimately hurting, I am sad to say that clear back from the 80s, there was this sort of self-protective attitude that came in there. And my family, we were led after, pure homeschooling to be involved with some of the things that said, okay, let's talk to those people in the public education. And we met with such angry responses from homeschoolers that we were. And we were the homeschoolers. My friend had been like the head of an organization, and when she stepped sideways to work in this other realm, she was completely ostracized. So I won't go into that except that that attitude has carried on. So they fight very hard for what they consider pure homeschooling, but they don't have the greater heart for many kinds of independent, creative, just passion-driven programs. And so I thank you, because the way you talk about regulation makes me not afraid, because I have the same, keep your head down, don't get regulated, don't turn into the mainstream, you know. But I have hope listening to you, and I pray that that self-protective, fear-based spirit that says, I will not support you and you're not one of us, because what you're doing will ultimately take away our freedoms. That's how they saw it. Ultimately, it's going to lash back the way you're talking about us wanting to make sure that doesn't happen. So bless you. Thank you. Pray for Washington State. Yes.
I'll just say you're welcome, and it is important that people like you and me get involved and connect with the policymakers for the very point that they mentioned. Like, it's going to be happening. We can either put our head in the sand and be like, oh, I don't want anything to do with that, or we can be like, wait a minute, this is happening. I need to be involved and make sure it's happened well, that things are written well. Otherwise, yeah, we do have some risk involved if we're not. There's risk when we are involved too, of being ostracized or, you know, that sort of thing. You know, I'm kind of an anomaly of a homeschooler in my area specifically, but I believe so much in the movement. And again, I hear what you're saying, because that attitude of this self-preservation is not okay. And shame on us for that. And we can do better. And we can be gracious to other people who are unable to homeschool fully, and we can want what's good for them and for their family as well. So.
Okay, I think we have time for two more. So we have Tarla and Jamie.
First of all, I want to thank you for this. This is very encouraging to us. I am feeling a bit distraught, because Michigan, you know, one of the last states to be able to homeschool. When they became homeschoolers, they had total freedom. And then this last week, things have been gone through that look like they're changing that. And that makes us very frustrated, because we work hard to let them know how important our homeschooling freedoms are, yet it doesn't seem to matter. And that's very discouraging. I too have gone through where being a homeschooler, making homeschool programs, then working with the public school and bringing some things together so that we have options. And I have appreciated that ability to do that. I appreciate the ESAs that are coming, but I'm a little bit concerned about the locking down that we are experiencing. And I appreciate the help that people are doing for our state, but knowing that as hard as we're working, still they totally disregard what we're doing and seem to want to shut us up and clamp us down. So.
I would like to say that Michigan has a lot of hope, and we will do whatever we can. Michigan's Blaine Amendment is very, very bad, and it's caused a lot of problems. Just as a point of order, I assume you know Bernita Bradley in Detroit? Bernita Bradley. She runs Engaged Detroit. Her program is she's a black single mother in the middle of Detroit that is training others. She is someone you should, because I'm hoping if that voice wasn't part of this conversation, then that could be one of the reasons why it's getting tamped down. The diversity of voices needs to be really clear, and I need to make sure that if we can help do that in Michigan to make sure there's a broad array of voices, we would love to help do that.
So just over 2 years ago, I was a school founder, kind of doing some policy stuff in my own state. There was a huge learning curve when I got introduced to this work, thanks to an EdChoice event that I got invited to that I thought was a spam email because I didn't know what EdChoice was, but then I went ahead and went. It was like, you are one of 25 chosen. I was like, this cannot be legitimate. Here I am. But there was a huge learning curve, and I love this panel because we've got represented academia research, we've got a national organization in the space, we've got a state policy, expert here, and then you've got a practitioner on the ground. I wondered if each of you could possibly provide for the audience maybe a description of what you see your role is in this space, from the research kind of informing and influencing policy, and the local ones getting to be the ones that actually implement it in their state, and then how that affects the practitioner.
Yeah, so, part of our role is this, right? Is everybody coming together to talk about this. But then, the other side of what we do is the academic research, and that's where we honestly could use your help, right? If you're a public school or a charter school version of one of these things, we can, as time permits, we can do good research on there. But I'm going to make another pitch for this in a minute, but when we make a call for data, this is what we need from you all, right? Because that lets us do things like figure out what do you care about, right? Aside from test scores and SATs and other things. And, where are you and who are you and what should the field look like and what does it look like, right? All of that stuff takes data being inputted, and part of the value of this movement is that it's not all standardized, but part of the absolute nightmare of doing academic research is that it's not at all standardized, right? So that's what kind of we're working through now. Yeah.
You can't have random assignment surveys every time, right?
Yeah.
So from a national perspective, EdChoice will continue to work with Eric and others on the data. We are the centralized data source for all choice programs, right? And we want to continue to be that. We want to show the stories of how choice is growing, right? And we do that in every state. So we're going to do the research and the data. We want to be involved in the training and the outreach part of it. And by that I mean, look, we learned a lot from West Virginia and made mistakes, and we got to take that kind of information to Iowa, to Arkansas, to help train the people on the ground to be good at, be more advocating, be part of the advocating process, be part of the coalition, and be part of, here's how it happens when you get implementing ESA programs, for example. And then we need to make sure we advocate for good policy going forward. EdChoice will be working a lot more on regulatory reform in the coming years. And then 4, we have a legal arm that will defend you in courts.
Yeah, for us, we do original research. We publish that. We take what is going on at the national level in academia. We try to filter that through our state lens. And then we're the nexus really between all of that and the people in the state capitol who are making the decisions. We can't push the button for them, but we can talk them into, up to the point where they're making that decision. And then also a public education. I'm always educating the public is what I mean, not public schools. And educating the public standpoint, so we are trying to talk to regular, everyday Georgians about these issues through digital means and emails and newsletters and everything else. So it's really where a lot of this gets connected to people in the state, whether they're lawmakers or not.
And I would just say my role is to open the lines of communication, and people are familiar with, there's the micro level of systems, like in social work. There's micro level systems, there's macro level, and then there's this meso level right there. And so being on the ground at the micro level as a founder, as a parent, as an educator, I can help communicate with these guys up here at the macro level, because I have this organization of education entrepreneurs and networking with other parents and things like that. So I can help inform, as he mentioned, our policy makers and those who are drafting bills, like, hey, can you add this and remove that? So.
All right. Thank you all so much, panelists. Let's give them a hand. Right?